Hello everyone, my name is Eric and I'm the developer of Virtue's Heaven, which is an upcoming action/adventure platformer about living at the end of history and creating a future and all that kind of stuff. The tagline still needs some work. In this video, I kind of want to go through at least some parts of this gigantic mess of ideas and things that I was thinking about what this game might be and might still be, but maybe not be anymore, who knows, and talk a little bit about like my design process with this game and how I laid out my ideas and tried to like sort out my ideas. If you're interested in the tool that I've been using for this, the tool is called Domino 2, which you can find at cool.tools/domino2. I will also put a link in the description of this video. It's a very nice and free thing that you can use, and like where you can create like mind maps and like sort your ideas and all that kind of stuff. And I found it really helpful for this game, much more helpful than just like putting down ideas in a notebook, which I'm still doing, but having the opportunity and the possibility to like collect separate like ideas into like larger piles and like connect them to some degree and like help me a lot in like figuring certain things out. To some degree, it's not completely, again, reflecting the current state of what I want this game to be. This is kind of also like, it is a combination of the current state of this game's like overall design document or whatever, and also kind of like a historical document of like the process I went through, where that led to like the current like state of what this is. And yeah, I want to show this off also like kind of as an example of for the folks who would like to support my work on Patreon, and like I want to do this like this video as kind of an example of like, okay, this is the sort of stuff you might be able to expect from me in terms of like additional things and information about like my design process and like behind the scenes looks and all that kind of stuff. If you're willing to support me, which you can do for just $5, that gives you like access to like a bunch of potential things. The campaign has just started, so there isn't like a lot of stuff, and also I kind of want to do like some of these things in a public way, again, as a way to show, okay, this is what you can expect if you like keep supporting me. But this video, for example, will be publicly viewable for everyone. And yeah, again, keep in mind, this isn't like the finalized like whatever design Bible or whatever, which doesn't exist. It's more like, okay, let's go through some of my ideas of this, ramble through them. Maybe I find even new ideas and all that kind of stuff, and just talk a little bit about what I wanted Virtue's Heaven to be and what it ended up being, and all that kind of stuff. So the good thing about Domino is that you can zoom out and zoom in at every different points. So again, I'm probably not going through like everything, but like through like the larger things, and like I'll also like let you know if things aren't up to date anymore. So like what I started out was like back then. I have no idea when I started working on this. I think it must have been like February or March when I like realized that I had no real idea what I wanted this game to be, and that I needed to find a way to like work through all of the issues that I had. And I started by setting out a bunch of principles that are kind of like something that all of my games have, like the idea of the player being a force of nature, which then led to this point as like thinking about the player as like what specific kind of force of nature are they? And I ended up with like they're more like wave in the sense of like they gain strength over time, but also break and then have less strength for a while until they reform again and all that kind of stuff. That's like part of it. Like part of like the overall feel is like what I said. I was like, you can only fast travel back to your home, which I'm still like thinking about. Maybe I'll do that, maybe not. the very big principle of this game is like never gate progression behind a movement upgrade. That the player is a bringer of change, so that the world is in a different state once the player has traversed it. That opening doors changes the world on a fundamental level, which I'm not like, which isn't that big of a deal anymore at this point. That there are no closed doors, they are just very hard to push open, which again is something where I'm probably not very that close to it. You will see like remnants of like what I wanted this to be at some point, and like maybe I'll talk about why I, like, if I can recall why I decided against that, or like went into a different direction. Not really decided against it, but like found something else more interesting. And there's like something that, like, while I was thinking about this stuff, then realized, okay, like the difference, or like what a normal Metroidvania very often is that the world is static to a very large degree. Obviously, there, like, to some degree something changes, like an area gets flooded, like a window gets blown up or whatever, but like mostly the world is static, and what changes is the player. The player is what gets more abilities and what gets more access to like areas and all that kind of stuff. And what I set out then is then like, okay, like the next part, the only way to prevent the player from progressing is to either hurt or kill them. And this is like something that's like started to get very important for me to some degree, interestingly enough, that the home instance gets more comfortable the further the players have progressed through the game's story. Which means I'm going to move over here, because this is something I kept thinking about, like, on and off over the past few months, every once in a while. How much platformer level design is nothing more but an exercise in designing hostile architecture. Like hostile architecture in the sense of like wanting to prevent people from, or making it incredibly uncomfortable for people to exist in these spaces. So like these are like examples that I think you can find on the Wikipedia page about hostile architecture. I think I got these images from there. By the way, apologies for like maybe not being able to credit all of these things or whatever. This is like, again, like a thing I made privately for myself. I'm sharing these things, so like I haven't really paid that much attention about attributing everyone and everything. If I were to do a longer talk about everything and be more structured, I'd probably like go back and like would go back and like make sure that everything is like in order. But like for mostly private thing that I'm just going to share like an impression of, like, here, I figured that it's okay to not like to be a bit more lenient with that. But anyway, these are like examples of hostile architecture. Like the most like obvious one is the one above, which is like spikes to prevent homeless people from living under bridges, or like one thing. This is like a very simple thing that doesn't affect humans like primarily, but like anti-bird nesting spikes, like spikes that prevent pigeons from like landing on certain areas, that kind of stuff. That's also an example of hostile architecture. And also in general, if you think about it, the only places where you can see spikes in the real world are like, or like are most likely to see spikes in the real world, are like examples of hostile architecture, of like people designing spaces specifically to make it uncomfortable for people to exist in them. And that's kind of also the goal of platformer level design. If I'm putting spikes somewhere, that means I don't want you as a player to be in that space. I want to force you into a different situation. I want to kind of funnel you into like a specific enemy encounter, or into like using a specific set of movements just to like move past it and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like a very similar idea. And what I want to do with this and this idea of like, okay, the world, at least your home area, gets less hostile the longer you or the further you progress in the game, or the more of your friends you freed from prison, is the idea of like the like that area being like fairly hostile at the beginning and getting more and more livable the more people are there to like remove these parts. I really want to make areas where like you free a certain person and then you go into that room and the spikes that were there like before are gone. I want to build something like that and to kind of reflect that idea. Another idea that I have that you can see in the current, like if you have access to it, can see in the current like preview build of this game is I want to create something where like in each checkpoint you have to like move past some spikes or some kind of obstacle to get there, to again reflect this idea of like this world making it unpleasant for you to get comfortable and to feel safe. And again, this is kind of like the idea behind it, like make non-compliant ways of existence as unpleasant as possible. And yeah, the idea of like destruction of hostile environment is tied to the dungeon completion, which is again an idea I kind of like moved away from, not because I don't like it, but more like because like the way that what I call dungeons or larger areas ended up serving a different purpose than like what existed back when I put this down. Again, they like hostile architecture, or like the ways this dictate how a space is supposed to be used versus how maybe people want to use it. And also like overall, like the land itself is draining your life force to some degree, because that's also like a hostile world. And yeah, like one thing I want to keep like to talk about this is like another thing that I set up, because I always talk about, okay, the world is dying in Virtue 7. Like, how exactly is the world dying? What does this even mean? Like, I'll talk about the world building in a moment, but this was like something where I thought about it. Okay, what exactly does this mean? So there are two principles on which like the world in Virtue 7 as it exists at the beginning of the game works. The first one is that the world belongs to humans, and the second one is that the world exists so that humans can extract value out of it. If you feel this is somehow familiar to something else, to something we like that's like current like political state of the world, yeah. And out of this thing, and like in general, like if you then think about, okay, and we want to make things unpleasant, want non-compliant ways of existence, like ways of existence that are non-compliant to this part, we need to extract value out of it, and it belongs to someone. And if you then go to this part where it's about making non-compliant ways of existence unpleasant and impossible to exist, that leads to the point of everything that doesn't fit into a world needs to be destroyed. And because the world itself doesn't fit into this concept, because the world itself doesn't belong to humans and doesn't exist to extract value out of it, value and resources, that means that the world itself must die. It's not really something where like someone like evil overlord in an evil overlord way just decides, I want to destroy the world. It's more like that the destruction of the world is the logical consequence of the philosophy that guides like the behavior and like actions of the powerful. And yeah, so that's like basically the idea of like the world itself. Maybe let's talk a little bit about the world building. Let's go over here a little bit. So the world building and the idea that I have with this game is that one important part is to hell with the Enlightenment and also to hell with the end of history. These are like two like real world philosophical concepts that I don't really like. The Enlightenment is a school of philosophy that I have even like I don't really know like when exactly it came into being like historically, but like the core people behind it are like René Descartes, I think John Locke, and was it Thomas Hobbes? I forgot the first name. Immanuel Kant is another one. Voltaire, I think also, like these kinds of people, and Rousseau, I think also. And the idea behind the Enlightenment, or like one thing I'm going off here, is like in the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant wrote an essay that, well, I think the English title is like what is the Enlightenment? Like it's like it was like an originally a German essay because it was German or like Prussian like in that regard, because Germany at that time didn't exist. And like the first sentence he wrote, and I'm paraphrasing this here, also because I don't really like the way it was translated. Basically he wrote it like that the Enlightenment is the liberation of like humans from their self-imposed how do I like it's not really imprisonment, but basically a state of like dependency on others to some degree. And the important part there is like, and also like you can, I think, look up the essay. And again, I think it's just called like, what is enlightenment? You can look it up. It's not a very long read. And contrary to most of the other stuff that Immanuel Kant has written, it's actually kind of readable, which is kind of nice. But anyway, and what I kind of find interesting here, and if you look about like stuff like neoliberal capitalism and all that kind of stuff, and overall like the Enlightenment philosophy and the image of like what the Enlightenment created as the image of like what humanity is and what human characteristics are, is like one of the guiding principles of capitalist society. It's the thing and the factor that drove it and that gave it justification to do the things that it does. And like, for example, this obsession with individual responsibility for their own situations and their own problems is something that is both core in like capitalist or neoliberal society in which we live, and also like Enlightenment philosophy, is you are responsible if you're oppressed to some degree. If you're like, it's because it's a self-imposed oppression that you could move out of it, which again, you would have to like be a bit more precise and like look at it in more detail. But that's like kind of what I'm going off here, is that basically this is a world where individuals are blamed for their own oppression despite other factors, for example, material conditions and other kinds of stuff, or historical like structures that have like come into being are chiefly responsible for them. And the end of history is a thing, just quickly, is an idea that came into being after the fall of the Soviet Union, was written by Francis Fukuyama, like an American philosopher, and his idea was, because communism was defeated by liberal democracy, there is no more further like historical strife or whatever, and we basically reached the end of like humanity's progress through history, and the epitome is liberal capitalist society, which evidently is not true. We did not reach the end of history, and everything is kind of like now in a reactionary turn, but like and what's interesting about that idea, and this is like something where I personally just feel like we still live in this kind of space where like there's this idea of like that nothing will ever really change anymore, and we just like exist in like this weird space we live in since like the mid to early 90s, even though that things have changed. Like one thing I like go back to like a few months ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was an article, I think on Bloomberg or whatever, where they wrote that 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they had to correct themselves because it's been 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. But you can easily think that it's been only 20 years because for some reason time is like has entered this weird state where like it feels that nothing really changes anymore. So that's like kind of like the overall concepts I want to base Virtues Heaven like state on, or the world in Virtues Heaven state on when the game begins. There's an enlightened monarch, which again is a term I took from like a place of history because Frederick I of Prussia, which was a king of or like the first king of Prussia, or in Prussia as he like called himself or had to call himself for like weird political reasons, in I think the late 18th century, and he was created like a form of like monarchy or like absolutism that was called enlightened absolutism, and he was kind of like heralded as this like embodiment of like enlightenment virtues in a king. And that's like something I want to go by, because if you look at like what he did politically and how he behaved himself and what like desires he had on like how to use, like, for example, Poland and all that kind of stuff, you could also make an argument that he was a proto-fascist before fascism actually existed. And it's like, again, from a historical perspective, kind of interesting, but this is where I take the name enlightened monarch off. It's not something like, again, it kind of sounds like something out of a Souls game. I think in Elden Ring there's something that's incredibly similar, but I hadn't played Elden Ring when I came up with this term. But the original like idea I took from like Frederick I of Prussia. And this is like where I'm taking off. Anyway, the enlightened monarch created virtuous heaven, which is the world we live in, like you live in at the beginning of the game, in order to erase all history. And when you erase history, obviously, and like basically make everything uniform, you erase all strife, because history, like strife, like is formed, strife and conflict, is born out of like historical things. And the world shall belong to those that are virtuous, which means those who own property and who are like in the philosophical sense enlightened. And why are there barely any humans left in this world? And this is like basically, in order to gain the right to keep existing in virtuous heaven, more and more people sold themselves into servitude. Their body and minds have been changed to better serve their bosses. So basically, this is like a weird hyper-capitalist thing. With like private land ownership and all that kind of stuff that happens. The enlightened monarch has enslaved the world itself and is living off of it, lives at the center of it. He extracted the world's power to create prosperity, but the weaker the world became, the more restrictive he and his paladins became. The paladins are basically what I started calling the large, like the end of area bosses. I might change these names, who knows. Stopping this slow spiral towards oblivion would mean ending the world as they know it, which is why they can't stop doing it. Again, this goes back to the stuff I showed earlier about you would have to realize that the way you think about the world and the core concept of your existence is wrong. And since you can't really do that because it's also the base of your power, you just can't stop doing it, which means, obviously, like in the end, the world will destroy itself, or like the rulers of the world will destroy the world because the world needs to be punished for not being able to comply to their own rules. After years of servitude, the world itself has forgotten what it means to have a future. The only way to create a future for this world is to destroy its chains, meaning like all of this stuff. And the thing is like the question at the end is, are you ready to end the world, even if it means to create something you can't exist in? That's like something this might probably not come up. This is again like just like the way this stuff on Domino works a lot of the time for me is like I start with like something and then like a train of thought gets developed. Let's talk a little bit about this part, because again, this is like stuff that informs the level design and all that kind of stuff. One book I've been reading on and off since like the beginning of this year is called Revenge Capitalism. It's written by Max Haven. It's actually not that long. I'm just like very slow at reading about it. And there's a lot of very, very, very interesting stuff in that thing. But it starts with this sentence that is like, when you live in somebody else's utopia, all you have is revenge. What he means by that is not that if you basically are part of a marginalized or oppressed group in like, for example, in like capitalist society, that the only way you interact with this thing is like taking revenge for your own oppression. That's not really what he means by that. It's more like that because you're oppressed and because you're like your existence itself runs counter to the established norm, the like society itself will keep enacting revenge against you, also out of fear that you might enact revenge against them. So that's kind of like the idea behind it. There's also like, what does like a vengeful world mean? I'm still like working through that, like how I would like to reflect this part in the game's level design. I'm still working on that. And yeah, like you're not really like Virtua 7 isn't a game about revenge. You're not going out and taking out your rightful anger at those that are oppressing you and your friends and your comrades. That's not the point of this game. What you're doing is you're trying to create a world that is based on different principles than the one before, and the existing world fights back against you, and like the conflict is what is like it's more about, or it's supposed to be more about the conflict between these two and like trying to like move past that state. And to some degree, to move past such a state, it might be necessary to completely remove the previous structures of power. That might be something that's necessary in order to create a future. But it's not the core idea isn't that, oh, and now the powerless have power and will enact revenge on those that oppress them, and that's it. That's a very narrow view of everything. So, and that's like something, again, that then goes back to like the idea of you having a home, and that home kind of changing depending on who's there and how many people are there, and all that kind of stuff. Kind of like trying to reflect a change of like the space, and kind of like reflecting that it's not only about going out and ripping out the heart of like powerful beings to gain access to the center of the world so that you can kill a king. That's also part of it. But in the process of doing that, you are also help create something that prepares like for whatever comes after this. For like the world in Virtua 7 is stuck in an eternal day because time has kind of stopped moving. And what you're doing is you create the potential for another day to happen, and you create the potential, or like create a world for like people to be prepared for like whatever comes after the sun has set and a new day has come. That's kind of like the idea behind all of that part. And that's why it's important for me to make this game not only about like you are this one character that does this stuff. You are a character that does these things, but there are other people who are also doing things in their own context. By the way, this is a build from like a different game, but this is like for me the idea. Okay, these are the kind of like the people that you are like freeing from prison and all that kind of stuff. Fast travel system is a dog that is a mixture of like a Labrador and Fremd from Dark Souls. Again, this is like the biggest Souls, like Dark Souls, probably inspiration of that. What's still interesting here, so that's kind of like the old convoluted part of the world building. Maybe talk a little bit about this part. Not that much. I don't even know where I got this from. This is like a bit like when I share this is like something that came around like when the Elden Ring came out. This was part of a longer thread about like how FromSoft games create enemy encounters very often, of like, oh, you see something that's of interest and you walk into the room and then enemies ambush you, and then like playing off of that idea, kind of just took this image to remind myself of like that thing of what I might be able to do with that in terms of level design, because the overall level design was something I was kind of struggling with like Virtua 7 for a while, where I didn't know, okay, what to do. Another thing that helped me a ton with this was like from Marina Kitaka, when she and Melos released Symphony, which I still have to play. She did a longer thread about, or like not a longer thread, it's 3 tweets about the differences between like having platformers with a larger move set, or like the interplay between platformers with larger move sets or smaller move sets, and platformers with a lot of like complex level design and like level gimmicks and all that kind of stuff, and platformers that are very simple, and like how these interact with one another, and like what your overall goal is. And since Virtua 7 is a game that has a lot of moves, and one thing I've been struggling with really is because my previous games were very heavily inspired by Mega Man games, and Mega Man games, even though they have to some degree additional moves, but if you go back to like something like Mega Man 2, which is like very often like being heralded as like the distillation of what Mega Man is, you don't have any special moves. You run, you jump, and you shoot. That's all you do. And the complexity in the platforming mostly comes through like specific interactive elements and like level design gimmicks within each level, and also like enemy placements and combat design to some degree. But it's mostly like the platforming challenges are fairly distinct platforming challenges with like distinct gimmicks, and each level, for example, in Mega Man 2 has one kind of platforming gimmick associated with it, and it plays around with these things. And I build like Splinter Zone and also GB Rover around these things because they're kind of like similar. However, what I found out when I tried to do this with Virtue's Heaven is that it doesn't really work because you're so incredibly mobile that the platforming gimmicks are just pointless. Or mostly pointless, because you can just dash through almost everything. And that would then mean I would either have to restrict your movement or do other stuff, and I don't really want to do that. And I kind of figured out, and then stuff kind of clicked, and I also looked at like level maps from, like, for example, the Game Advance Castlevania games. And one thing you notice when you look at something like the map of Area of Sorrow, like the actual area maps, not the in-game map you can see, one thing you realize is that a lot of these maps have areas, for example, that are just like left to right or right to left horizontal planes with like different compartments where enemies are placed, and barely any platforming at all. There are platforming sections, and there are like maybe some like more complex things like the clock tower areas or whatever, but these are very separate things, and most of the time it's mostly about, not really about like making the traversal of the areas feel interesting, and not really making the traversal the main focus of everything, but more like having the combat encounters and the enemy designs and like the movement from A to B, the thing that is the interesting part, and not as much about like, okay, here is the section where there's like platforms that float up and down like in the rhythm of the music or whatever, and all that kind of jazz. And that's something that really, where this graphic really helped me like trying to understand how I should approach the level design for Virtue's Heaven, and how it's like really is on a like fundamental level different to my previous games. And also it kind of helped me to realize why I just don't get along with certain other Metroidvania games, because these games very often end up with complex movesets, and then also like trying to do like Super Meat Boy style like high difficulty degree platforming, and that just doesn't work for me. Yeah, like trying to go more into kind of like definitely like probably more like into this lower right corner with, yeah, sure, there's like complexity and stuff like that, but it's like very limited in the degree of like platforming complexity overall. So that's like kind of the thing. Also, I'm seeing that the vertical axis moves are powerful and have multiple functions and are limited. So like it's probably more like here, but like I'm seeing this more like as like a level design complexity scale to some degree. Cool, I misread it. Anyway, that's like kind of where I still end up with like, okay, try to look not only at the Game Boy Advance Castlevanias in terms of like, okay, this is because like the Game Boy Advance Castlevanias, like Area of Sorrow, is like a fairly strong inspiration in the sense of like, this is what got me interested in Metroidvania style games in terms of like movement expression, because it feels like really interesting to move around in these games, especially when you're like in a later state of them. The problem is that the game's then over. And like the one thing that always like pushed me forward with this game is like, what if you like just start out with the full moveset and then have to traverse the space and like try to make that interesting? Like kind of like doing I'm doing the Julius mode version of like like a Metroidvania game where you already have a character that can go everywhere, or like more or less go everywhere, and it's just about moving through the space, trying to figure out where to go, and like have the challenges and the exploration be built around different principles and all that kind of stuff. So that's like what's here. The structure idea is like very, to a huge degree, outdated. This is like the only part that's interesting here is like the mapping, like the things you find for like your map and your points of interest are called mapping birds and stumblebees. And what I also still need to do is like I want to create specific enemies you have to defeat to free these. So these are also imprisoned. You always have to like everything that helps you. You have to like free out like a free like or break out of some kind of prison or imprisonment situation. And these will be called, what did I say? Bird keeper and bee watcher or whatever. Because just doing bird watcher and beekeeper would be too simple. So that's like something that's there. Let's see, is the conviction part is a bit, there's also like a weird spoiler that I just don't look at it. This is like mostly outdated. This is about the charge attacks. Oh yeah, one thing that this might be interesting, even though it's like still this is also outdated, like the overall loop. A previous version had the idea that basically only mini bosses gave you zeal. And so, like, by progressing through an area, you would, like, defeat a boss. This one would give you enough zeal to gain, like, to gain one level. And that level would then enable you to open more doors and, like, to kind of mimic a sort of Metroidvania-like progression without ever, like, having you unlock movement upgrades. I moved away from that one. And that had mostly to do with how I ended up implementing the charge attacks and the permanent upgrades that you have and all that kind of stuff, because this system didn't make much sense for these other ideas, so I moved away from it and made it instead that enemies give you zeal. So and I also wanted to make something where it's about, okay, what is like, what do you get from like, how do you handle zeal? What do you do when you die? What are the things that you can still tie into it? And this is like something, if you watch the walkthrough of the area which I talked about, like, okay, you drop zeal on death, so kind of like Dark Souls, but more like, okay, maybe more something like, if you reach your bloodstone without dying again, you get a bonus. Don't punish, reward players instead. This is like another like very core thing for me. When I try to build systems, and I want to kind of encourage a certain kind of like play style, I'm not perfect at this, but like what I'm really trying like very often is to build something where it's more about rewarding a specific kind of play style, rewarding a specific kind of behavior that I find would like to see more of, like playing, engaging with, instead of like punishing them for playing differently, which in an overall, like a very overall thing, ties back into all of this hostile architecture, like revenge world thing, if you think about it, because it's kind of like a very similar thought about it. Like, instead of like punishing people for not fitting in, try to reward behavior that you would like them to do, or that you would like them to express, and not as much work with the punishment. I can kind of like have a cop out here, because I can always say, yeah, it's the world, like the world itself is built in such a way that it's punishing you, and like to some degree I'll do that. I even have like a comment on that planned, from within the game. But anyway, so there's like, this is like the overzeal or overzealous state. Picking up your zeal stain can extend your zeal meter past your limits. Zeal slowly decreases to its regular maximum. Killing enemies while in overzeal can extend that time. I haven't implemented that, by the way. Damage speeds up your charge attacks and maybe regenerates health. You're invincible during that part. And that's like kind of there's like also like I wanted to do a conviction where like basically you keep your zeal or some zeal after death, but it also creates basically your full zeal sense. So basically you can get like extra, you basically create a reserve of stuff. An interesting part I realized with progression when I set out for this. So and you can slightly see that in the area that I built out, but since I created it, like before that, the structure idea was this is kind of a closed system. So you go out, you defeat the mini bosses, collect zeal, open the doors in these areas, but it's all confined within that area. If you were to go into a dungeon, defeat 2 bosses, gain zeal level 2, and then then go out of that place, that zeal that you collected would only be viable within that space. And that was another part that I just didn't feel comfortable with, and where I thought it feels weird to do it that way and all that kind of stuff. So like this makes a bit more sense, because what I could do now theoretically is, since defeating larger enemies also increases your maximum amount of zeal, is theoretically I could do something Metroidvania-ish in the terms of like having like gating progression through, like, for example, you go into one area that is accessible like right at the start at zeal level 1 or whatever, and you run past the door that has zeal level 5 or requires you to have level 5, which you can't have at that point. So you would have to find a way around that. And the idea is, again, to maybe do it in such a way that later areas can be accessed either, there's a typo in here, through zeal gates or via alternative secret routes that are very hard to do. Again, to kind of not completely close, like slam the door shut, but to make it so that you could go there, but it's kind of difficult to do. And that, again, could tie into this whole like hostile architecture and like making the space more welcoming, because you could, like, the idea I had yesterday is like to build the home area in such a way, like if you support the Patreon, you get access to the current version of like what the game is, and the home area there is like fairly small. I would like it to be larger, and to serve it as kind of like a hub area from which every path moves away, like kind of like this is like kind of the idea for this. So, and I would like this one to be larger and kind of have different paths be slightly like harder or easier to traverse in terms of like overall platforming difficulty and all that kind of stuff. However, these areas, like these harder areas, could get easier if you free more friends from prison, and these friends then will go into this area here and make it more approachable for people and make it more comfortable for people, and have like another layer of like progression gating built into this, aside from, okay, you need to have like a specific zeal level to open this door. Kind of like that. We will completely ignore the what is the final area going to look like, because that's something I'm not going to tell anyone. And last part, maybe in that thing that also like, again, like in terms of like, okay, how do I build this stuff? It's like thinking about what enemies are, and then like this is like brainstorming what could enemies be, and then enemies are structures that prevent you from reaching your goal, and then the point. And again, this is why this tool is so great, because it can lead you, like, can help you structure out your thoughts and then get to different parts and then wonder, okay, what exactly is your goal? And then thinking about, okay, you have like proximate goals, like things that are like imminent or near, like get somewhere, free your friends, find a heart in an area. And ultimate goal, like destroy the world, create a future, find out or understand who you are or who you want to be, that kind of stuff. And these things obviously interact with one another, and usually enemies are in like this part of it, and this is like, and this is kind of like the structure. You fulfill your proximate goals to some degree, and that will lead you to like fulfilling or like reaching the ultimate goals in the end for these games. So is there like something else? This is like older stuff. I probably fill stuff out. Yeah, there will be a rival in this game. This is like the idea for like overall boss design, like which I want them to be in the end. Kind of like weird mechanical versions of like biblically accurate angels, because I kind of find the idea interesting of like kind of like the religious reverence of like industry to some degree, like kind of like build around that. This is like a place where I have like, which is like not very laid out, but like place where I could put enemy ideas in, which doesn't exist. Anyways, I think I'm mostly like done with what I want to talk about. But you can see there's a lot of stuff, and I'm like, there's still a lot of space left on this. But I have no idea if there's even like if there's even a limit. Who knows? Anyway, this has been fairly long and fairly like convoluted, maybe to some degree. But I just wanted to show like, okay, these are the thoughts I have when I sit down and try to figure out, okay, what kind of game do I want to make? What do I want this to feel like? Even though like in the end, the interaction is you fly through the air and like kick some weird robot thing in the face and it explodes. That's like the end result of all of this. However, like the stuff that guides me along are like these ideas, are these thoughts about like, okay, how can I structure the world? Because very often for me, like the biggest issue is to create a space where all of this bullshit makes sense, where it makes sense that you fly through the air and kick a robot in the face and it explodes. And I need to find an explanation for me for it to make sense and for it to have a purpose, because otherwise I rarely have the motivation to finish a project. So that's like why I like thinking about that, and why I like building my games in this way and like think about this stuff in such a way. There exists like something similar, not like as elaborate as this one, like for GB Robo and also for Splinter Zone, because I need these structures and these things in place to make my games, and that's what's driving it forward, and that's kind of like what will guide the way the overall like game will play out, and what you encounter, and what problems you face, and what like goals you will have, and like what people you meet, and all that kind of stuff. I hope this made any amount of sense. This again has been fairly long, and yeah, support this game on Patreon. Support my work on Patreon. That would be cool. I'm probably like, don't expect, okay, this will be like weeks and weeks of like 50-minute videos about like convoluted bullshit, but expect like something like just insights about like, okay, this is what I'm thinking about right now. This is like what I've been doing. Here's like some sketches or some notes on like something that I've been thinking about that I would like to try out in this next area or whatever. Think about like something like that. You'll get access to that like when you support me, and again, access to the current version, like a very, very early version of the game, which gives you access to like the first area and like some other stuff. Again, once I've gotten around to like doing all the backend stuff, which I still haven't done because I've been busy producing content. Whatever. Anyway, hope you have a nice day. Hope this was interesting. Again, please wishlist Witches Heaven on Steam. At some point, game will come out, and you will see what all of this stuff will end up being. It's going to be great. I can feel it definitely. Yeah, and all that kind of stuff. And anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you watch this like for that long, and see you soon. Bye.